With the latest news of Nikon acquiring Red Cinema Camera Company, I am so happy that I was on the Nikon train before it was cool 2 years ago. But today we have to go through the Carfax because I was struggling in the comment section because everyone was so hell-bent on the fact that Nikon must have paid Red for licensing with respect to the lawsuit that happened once it was dismissed. And it never made any logical sense to me, even with the Red CEO's statements of there was a settlement. It looks like the settlement was more so, instead of us destroying the licensing business model that you have for your company, we are actually going to buy you out. And the reason why we're going to go through the Carfax is because we need to look at how this all started, who was really on Nikon's side, why they were important, what this could potentially mean for the camera industry. All of that we are going to talk about. So let's really get into it because this starts all back with the Nikon Z9. Now, Nikon did two things with the release of the Z9. They put in not only internal Nikon RAW, which is the important one, but also internal ProRes RAW. Now, the internal Nikon RAW is important because of who helped them create Nikon RAW. But internal ProRes RAW is also important because we know Red has gone after companies that have any internal ProRes RAW recording. We saw it with Kinefinity, we saw it with DJI, and furthermore, we also saw it with Apple themselves. They went after Apple with respect to ProRes RAW. I can't remember who exactly sued who, but we all remember that lawsuit with respect to that, right? So we knew at some point a lawsuit was going to come. The big red giant was going to come and hit Nikon with a lawsuit. So this brings us into kind of how these dominoes stacked up before that lawsuit, which is why we have to look into InPix, right? So InPix has a CEO named Gail Royvoy. And this is very important because Gail Royvoy has been an instrumental part in many of the codecs that we use, from JPEG to motion JPEG, but more importantly, JPEG 2000. Now, this is important because if you go back and look at the video camera patent by Red Cinema Camera Company, you will see that the prior art listed for that patent is JPEG 2000. They're simply using JPEG 2000, wavelet compression, and all of the other free industry knowledge that was out there, because that's how the cinema industry worked. That's how the camera industry was working. Is we're not going to patent things like codecs. That's like a camera company trying to patent a lens, right? So this is where we are so far, right? We have the release of the Z9, which has internal Nikon RAW and internal ProRes RAW, and Nikon, we know, was working with the guy whose prior art was listed in the Red patent, right? So after this, I ended up making my video about the Nikon Z9's RAW capabilities, but soon after that, the lawsuit comes out, right? And guess who's suing? Red is suing Nikon. Now, here's a little sidebar. When I was at NAB, I went over to the InPix booth because of the video that I had made about the Z9 and the RAW capabilities. And, I had heard from my connection at Nikon, hey, your video made it up to some pretty high boards and they were pretty impressed, right? And so I go over to the InPix booth, and there was one guy who was associated with InPix. He was working there. He didn't really pay me any attention, but I asked him, like, hey, can I go ahead and speak to Gail? And he was kind of a little hesitant, but Gail walked up and, I started talking a little bit about all the stuff he did. And he recognized, he's like, oh, you're the guy that made the video. And so I simply just asked him, what do you think about like the Nikon patent? And they're very tight-lipped over there. I shouldn't say the Nikon patent. I should say the Red patent. They're very tight-lipped over there. But they came back and they were essentially like, yeah, I don't think I have anything to worry about. I don't think there's really anything to worry about. That's what I was told. Now that all of this has come to fruition, I feel comfortable sharing that with you guys, right? Now, soon after this, right, somewhere in there, Nikon replied to Red's lawsuit. And this is going to be very important for my conversations with how I think this is going to unfold on a camera industry wide level, right? Nikon replied and basically said, y'all can kick rocks. We're not going to pay you anything. As a matter of fact, your patent is illegitimate, right? The phrasing and the wording that they used in their reply to that lawsuit is very, very important. And this is what made me know right then and there, Nikon is not about to pay you. And they're doing something that a lot of other camera manufacturers, well, one, they have attempted it, right? We know Sony attempted it. Uh, but I just always felt like there was never a really strong effort with the Carfax to go against Red. And I think that's why Gail's role in the creation of Nikon RAW was so important, because when you're the guy, when you have the person who created this on your side, in fewer words or less, helped create a lot of these codecs. Um, that's a big deal, right? So now you have the knowledge and you have the power to really go against. And that's similarly what you see in Nikon's reply to the lawsuit, is that this is not even the same technology. So after Nikon says kick rocks, a little bit more time goes on and the case was dismissed, right? Now, for me, it was clear. I didn't think Nikon was going to end up paying Red to begin with. Their language kind of made it clear, but just knowing all the inner workings in the background that have really went into the creation of this codec, I'm like, there ain't no way, right? But everybody was so hell-bent. There must have been a settlement. Red can't lose, yada, yada, yada. And then we had the CEO of Red come out and say, hey, yeah, there was a settlement. Well, this is where I'm like, yeah, I think it's very clear what the settlement was now. Nikon simply ended up buying out Red. And I think what happened, this is just my own personal perspective, looking at where the cake is crumbled, right? Where the cookie crumbled. With the knowledge probably going into that discovery phase of those hearings, it wouldn't shock me if Red knew that this actually wasn't a case that they wanted to fight, because there's a good chance that perhaps their patent could get overturned. And I think the reason why Nikon went ahead and bought Red, and this is where we're getting into this meat and potatoes here, is because you have two options, right? If you go and take this lawsuit down the road, right, or even expose how the lawsuit ended up ending, basically you just ruin Red's entire business model, right? They only made $159 million in 2023 with licensing and camera sales alone. In comparison, Nikon brought in $5 billion. That's also important. Keep that in mind, right? And the other big two camera manufacturers up there, Canon and Sony, were raking in similar profit. So you take away that licensing, you basically are taking away a big portion of that company's income. And then you're going to be wasting some connections, right? Why does it make sense that Nikon bought Red? Think about who Nikon now has access to. And before y'all come at me in the comments, just understand, it's very well known that Red was really sustaining themselves for a while on licensing alone. That's why they went so hard after a lot of these companies. And I'm asking you to look at the Carfax and really read between the lines on why you could come to a reasonable conclusion that Red was struggling. Even outside of the licensing thing, look at the way in which they've moved these past couple of years, specifically trying to make a move into the consumer market. I think that was completely an attempt to make more revenue to try to sustain the company, because your entire business model before that was somewhat to be like Airy, to focus on the Hollywood elite side, and that was going to be like your go-to. And if other people happen to hop on, then great, but your main focus was not the consumer, it was going to be the big budget films. So when we saw not only that shift to the consumer side, but then also like the creator side as well, that to me was kind of the red flag. Like, hey, good, I'm glad to see you enter the market, but is the pocketbook okay? So it's not me being a Red hater. I'm just trying to look at this from a logical perspective. What would have happened had Nikon not bought them? And why would Nikon go ahead and buy them, right? Well, Red makes the DXL2. And who do they make that for? Well, they make that for Panavision. This means that Nikon now has a direct connection to Red, which means a direct connection to Panavision, i.e. some of the biggest films in the world. And if you read the ending of that press release, it's very clear that Nikon intends to make a move most likely into the cinema world. They talk about contributions into the cinema camera industry. They don't have a cinema camera yet. And I'm thinking about the timing of all this. What's coming up in about a month? We have NAB coming up. I wouldn't be shocked if we did not see a Nikon cinema camera also hit the market at NAB. And when you think about it, Canon doesn't even have that connection, and they have the biggest market share with respect to cameras out of all of the three big manufacturers. The only other company that has a connection like that into the cinematography world is going to be Arri, right? So Nikon has really put themselves like in a checkmate position. Like, okay, it's your move. Like, this was the ultimate clapback, was buying red. Now go down this rabbit hole with me for just a little bit more, because this is why I think Nikon had the upper hand in this lawsuit. Other companies had to have known that these connections were possible by acquiring red. Tell me why Canon or Sony wouldn't do the same thing to get a pest off of their shoulders. I mean, Canon is practically sleeping with red. They're the only company that has access to the RF mount. And we know how much Nikon made, which is 5 billion. Canon made more than that. I can't remember. Let me actually look up the figures for you real quick. So some of these companies have external revenue factors outside of just cameras. Sony brought in 85 billion alone on all of their revenue. So this includes things like the video game department, PlayStation, etc. So take those numbers into account too. We have Canon who brought in 30 billion and Nikon who bought in 5 billion, right? So these other companies had to have known that this was an option. Why wouldn't they have taken the same shot? They have the money. I just don't think red was in a position to really sell. And I think that Nikon must have had some sort of upper hand in that conversation where the decision to sell the company becomes mutually beneficial for both parties instead of one party just bulldozing over the other, if that makes sense, right? So that's really what I think with respect to the Carfax, how all of this has played out. And when you start to even look at how some of the press around Nikon has gone, look at how many more creators have started talking about Nikon since in the past 2 years. And since that lawsuit came out too, right? We have creators like Brittany Jane and we have creators like Brandon Washington and a whole bunch of other people have really started talking about how good Nikon is. And in due respect too, that's no shade to anybody. It made no sense to me that Nikon was receiving so much hate when this is by far the best camera on the market right now if you are a hybrid shooter. The Nikon Z8 and Z9, no compromises. Come at me if you want to, right? So then this leads me into what does this mean for the rest of the camera industry? And I've seen some comments on some Facebook discussion groups talking about how, well, I'm not really sure that Nikon is gonna like release RAW. Why not? You just buy the company out, right? And then Nikon's gonna continue to hold a stickler on RAW because why would you help out the other competition? Well, here's the thought, first of all. Their partnership with InPix is a very strong one. And InPix's goal is to start bringing out better performing next generation codecs to all cameras, right? Because we are working with some archaic, right? Some archaic codecs, with the exception of like ProRes 422 and some of the newer ones we've gotten. A lot of this stuff is still kind of old, right? And technology has grown, but there's been a really big stifle on codecs because of this patent in general. And this also means raw recording. I mean, your only options really are Blackmagic RAW, which is not real RAW. Your other option would be ProRes RAW, which is real RAW, but is not widely adopted because of the patent. Cinema DNG, which is also real RAW, but has a lot of file handling problems that people don't want to deal with. And that's it. Those are your options, right? But we have all these manufacturers with all this resource and development. Think about what this means now. My thoughts and predictions, outside of there being a drop of a Nikon cinema camera, is that the impact this is going to have on the industry is I bet you're about to see Canon, Sony, Fuji, everybody is about to start having raw video recording on their cameras now. And there's probably not going to be a lot of drawbacks or limitations with respect to it just because of how high the bar has been set with some of Red's releases, with some of Nikon's releases, things that even the R5C can do. Everybody is about to have this probably across all of their lines at this point. That would be my thought. We're going to see a bigger adaptation around raw video. You're going to see companies now change their tone, talking about ProRes 444 is just as good, when it's like, y'all, I get it. We've been in the trenches, but let's be real with ourselves. When you're working with RAW, you have a lot more flexibility. It's not saying you can't get away with ProRes 444, but RAW is still superior, and you know that. Now, I do need to make one kind of counter argument, though, that people are making, which is Nikon's just going to hold this up. Y'all remember the wording in the lawsuit reply that Nikon gave. right? They called the patent illegitimate. You're going to be hard pressed in a legal battle now to try to uphold that patent when now other companies can use your lawyer's words against you, right? It doesn't make any sense from the perspective of one, what you were fighting against, two, the partnerships that you have, and then three, like I said, this is $159 million on Red's side. This includes their revenue from licensing versus a company that's already bringing in $5 billion. I believe that's like 39 times the amount that Red brought in. The licensing model is not one that I think they are going to pursue. So that's really my final thoughts on this situation. All of this came down for me, right? In my mind, all of this came down to Nikon's partnership with InPix. The knowledge that that company brought to the table on the technical side, on how you could really defend a case against Red and win, and then also the further implications that I think that that had to how Red would then need to move in that category to reap some benefit out of the situation. For self-preservation tactics, it just doesn't make sense to me that this cookie could have crumbled any other way, if that makes sense. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really wish my folks over at Nikon would start giving me like some type of heads up before news drops, because this interrupted my entire content schedule. I almost wanted to make a video last night and I'm like, look, I ain't about to lose no sleep over it. But I did want to really come to you guys in this forum to sit down and talk and go through and hash out what I think happened and what this means. You're going to see a lot of other videos come out about this most likely. I hope that they really bring into the conversation the connections that Nikon has, because I don't think you can really have a conversation about how this all unfolded by overlooking that part, if that makes sense. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for some more Nikon content coming up. Be sure to give me a big thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, turn on those post notifications. If you have not, follow me on social media. The links are in the description down below, as well as the YouTube fam. The links are also in the description down below. And now, my beautiful people, is to stop calling Nikon a potato. Welcome to Nikon, all of my beautiful Red owners. It's nice to have you here. And remember, if you're ever feeling uninspired, uncreative, or just want to give up on life, every day airplanes take off against the wind, and Nikon now owns Red. Keep climbing, stay inspired, and as always, stay fabulous. I'll see you beautiful people next time. Peace out.